You may be seated.
Morning. Good morning. So we're going to be taking a look at the second part of Judges. We're going to also be in Judges next week as well with Gideon, but the topic of small and mighty. And my wife and I, we help run a camp during the summer, and there's a game called Super Soccer, and there's two teams. This is like regular soccer, and it's made up of juniors, but also made up of seniors as well. And I want you to imagine for a moment that there's the team leader on one of the teams, and he walks up and says, you know what, I need all of the seniors to get off of this team. It's going to be juniors against the seniors and the juniors. And that's really the kind of moment that we're going to be walking into today with Gideon. God is going to show Gideon that his math does not equal Gideon's math. And that kind of math is just not a little bit upside down, it's completely upside down. And we're going to discover how God's math is, with just a little bit in his hand, equals a whole lot more than anything that Gideon could ever produce. So, last week we looked at Gideon, and he was in the wine press, he was hiding, he was surviving, he was asking hard questions. And do you remember what happened to Gideon? God met him there. In his lowest moment, God was with him. God called him mighty warrior before Gideon had done even a single mighty thing. And what happens next is one of the most stunning reversals that we find in Scripture. But before we get there, I want to bring us back to the anchor verse of this series, which is 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. And it says there, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not us." We need to keep that in the back of our mind as we're going through today's lesson, because God is about to do with Gideon's army is a picture of exactly what Paul is showing us here. God's power shining through what looks like something that is insignificant. And the question that we're going to answer this morning is why? When Gideon finally stepped into faith and raised an army, why did God turn around and make that army smaller? Why would God reduce what Gideon had? And what does that reduction mean for us? So, with that question in front of us, I want us to open up our text. We're going to be in Judges chapter 7 for this first verse, and then we're going to flip back to 6. But we're going to see how overwhelming this situation was for Gideon. In verse 12 of chapter 7 of Judges, it says, "And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance." Now let's flip back one chapter to chapter 6, verse 33. It says there, "Then all the Midianites and Amalekites and all the people of the east came together and crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel." So we're getting this picture that's painted of multiple enemy nations. They're joining forces against Israel, and they cross the Jordan. They're in the valley of Jezreel. And the scripture compares them to locusts. You can't count them. The camels were alone as many as sand that you would find on the seashore. And when you read that, it's just an overwhelming picture. There are so many enemies that you can't count them. There are so many camels that you can't count them. The valley is just covered. And before the story even gets started, it looks like it's already over. In chapter 6 and verse 34 it says, "But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him." So he had sent messengers throughout Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. The men responded to Gideon in every direction. 32,000 men showed up to fight. And Gideon is doing what most leaders would do when facing an overwhelming enemy. He's gathering every person that he possibly could. So if you put that into perspective, 32,000 men is really like the same size as Lewiston, Idaho, a couple hours south of here. So imagine every man, woman, child in Lewiston standing shoulder to shoulder. That's quite a sizable army, right? That's a real army. And that's a number that Gideon probably felt like he could build a plan around. And that's a number that would give you a little bit more comfort as you're walking into this battle, knowing that you have people beside you. So when we face something that is overwhelming, our instinct is to always count what we have. We want to gather, we want to stockpile, we want to reinforce, and I don't think that's wrong. Gideon did it. But notice what Gideon was doing. He was turning to himself instead of God. He was using his math instead of God's math. He was counting resources, he was counting men, he was counting what was in his hand. And God is about to challenge this situation and every instinct that we have about preparation and strength. Because again, God has his own math, and it doesn't look like ours, as we learned last week. Judges chapter 7, verse 2. And the Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.'" Did you hear that? Gideon's army was already outnumbered, and God said, "There's too many." I don't think Gideon probably felt that way. Not too few, too many. God wasn't just planning a victory. He was protecting the story. He needed the outcome to be so unmistakable that no one, not even the Israelites, could claim credit for it, except for God himself. He didn't want the Israelites turning to themselves and saying, "Hey, look what I did." That's the opposite of what God wanted. So God's not really just interested in winning. He's interested in making sure everyone knows who won. Because a victory that Israel could credit to themselves would not deliver Israel from anything. It would just give them a new idol to bow down to, their own strength. So here we have 32,000 men. God begins to reduce the army. The first cut is a deep cut. We're going to see Israel's army go from 32,000 down to 10,000 men. Verse 3. "Now, therefore, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead.' Then 22,000 of the people returned and 10,000 remained." So 32,000 became 10,000. More than 2 out of every 3 men walked away. Gideon's army was cut by 68% in a single announcement. For some reason, every time I say 68%, I think of Dylan like giving me that answer.
I did just go to a math competition.
Yeah, he just went to a math competition. So imagine you're standing there as a leader. You're watching 2 out of every 3 men pack up their gear and walk down the mountain. You came in with an army, and now you only have a third of that army left, and the battle hasn't even started. But what you do see is when you look over that valley, you still see an army that is thick as locusts. And notice what God didn't say. He didn't say the men who were afraid were bad men. He didn't say that they were failures. He didn't shame them. He just said, if you're afraid, you can go home. And 22,000 of them took that offer. And I don't think God here was weeding out any unworthy. He was revealing what was actually in the heart of those people. Because for what he was about to do, he needed people who were not looking for an exit. He needed people with faith. And here's what I want you to see. God didn't need the 22,000 people that left. He also didn't force them to stay. He let them go. And in letting them go, he made a smaller, clearer, more trusting people step into what he was about to do. And I want you to listen to this. God does not panic about the numbers. He never has. He's not pacing his throne room, wondering where everyone went. He's sovereign. He's positioning. And the people who remain, however few, are exactly enough for his hands. It's not about judging who stayed and who left. It's about trusting that God knows exactly what he needs in order to accomplish what he has planned. But what's interesting is God's not finished. 10,000 is still too many. So 32,000 became 10,000. 10,000 became 300. Gideon walked up the mountain with enough men to feel slightly hopeful about this battle. But now he's walking down with 99% of them gone. 300 men against an army as thick as locusts. So let's look at how God got there. Verse 4. And the Lord said to Gideon, "The people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them there for you." And Gideon had already lost, again, 2 out of every 3. He's down to 10,000. God looks at that 10,000 and says, "Too many." And to be honest, Gideon could have said, "Lord, out of respect, I don't see how this is too many." But he didn't. He obeyed. He took the men down to the water. Verse 5 and 6. So he brought them down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, "Everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink," and the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink the water. So God separated the men by something as simple as by how they drank water. 300 lapped from their hands, and 9,700 of them drank the water like a dog would drink water. That was the dividing line. And there's been a lot of commentary written about why God did this and what it meant for those 9,700. But I want you to notice that Scripture doesn't say. It doesn't explain it. God doesn't tell us that the lapping men were more alert or the kneeling men were weaker. He doesn't say that at all. God simply used that moment to separate out a very small group of people, 300. And from God's perspective, that 10,000 was still too big, so he had to get it down to 300. Verse 7. And the Lord said to Gideon, "With 300 men who lapped, I will save you. And I give the Midianites into your hand. And let all others go, every man to his home." God didn't say, "I'm going to save you with the 300 in your strategy. I'm not going to save you with the 300 in your courage." He says, "With the 300, I will save you." So that whole point of that reduction was to make sure that everyone knew where this victory was going to come from. He wanted to make sure Gideon knew it. He wanted to make sure Israel knew it. The Midianites knew it. And the watching world. He wanted to make sure that everyone knows whose hands won that battle. So can you imagine, and I didn't really think about this until I was putting this together, those 300, if they came from surrounding areas, what would it be like for those 300 to go back home after that victory? Do you think God would be glorified through that process? Absolutely. So, I just gave you a hint. Why does God do this? Why would he deliberately make us smaller before he makes his move? Listen really carefully to this. When God reduces what we have, it's not because he's given up on us. It's not because we've failed some spiritual test. It's because he's protecting the narrative of what he's about to do. Reduction is not rejection. Reduction is preparation. So when a church goes through a season of loss, people moving, relationships straining, capacity shrinking, resources are tightening, the human instinct is to panic. We count empty chairs, we measure what we used to be against to what we are now. We conclude that something's gone wrong. But what if God is not panicking? What if what feels like loss is actually God making room for what he is going to do? What if the 300 that remain are exactly enough for the victory that he is planning? You know, centuries after Gideon, there was a hillside of 5,000 hungry men plus women and children. And there was a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. The disciples looked at what he had and they said, it's not enough. But Jesus took what was very small and placed it into his Father's hands. And everyone ate until they were full. There were 12 baskets left over. And it was never about how much the boy had. It was about who he gave it to. So, stop counting what you have and start looking at what hands you're putting it in. Are you putting it in your own? Or are you putting it in God's? So 300 men in God's hands is more than 32,000 in Gideon's hands. So whatever you're holding today, however small it feels, that's not the point. The point is, whose hands are you putting it in? So some of you came in this morning feeling small, feeling like I'm not enough, I can't make a difference, feeling reduced, feeling like what you used to have has been taken away, and there's not enough left for what you're facing. You're tired, you're weary, and I want you to hear what God spoke to Gideon's 300. With 300, I will save you. You're not being rejected, you're being positioned. What feels like the end of resources is often the beginning of God's reputation, because he wins with a little, and everyone will know him. So a few closing points this morning. God is not panicking about what you've lost. He reduced Gideon's army on purpose. He is not surprised by your numbers. He is not overwhelmed by your shortage. Small in God's hands is always enough. 300 was enough. 5 loaves was enough. Whatever you're holding, placed in his hands, is enough. And God protects the narrative of his victories. He will not let us take credit for what only he can do. Sometimes he clears the stage so it's clear who did the work. Before we close, I want you to hear what Isaiah saw about the hands that we're placing our little into. It says in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 12, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span?" And I pointed this out last week. If you hold your hand, this little hole, hollow right here, that's what he's referring to. I can put like a few ounces of water in my hand. God can put all the oceans that we have into his hand. He talks about a span. A span is from the edge of your thumb to your pinky. God measures the universe that way. We just spent, a few astronauts spent 7 days up to get to the moon and back? That's not even compared to his span. We might measure a piece of wood with that. But that's nothing for God. That's the God that we're talking about here. That's the same hand that held Gideon's 300. That's the same hand that boy put those 5 loaves into. That's the same hands that you need to put your 2 little into. So whatever you have in your hand, it's more than enough for God. So, if you've been counting what you don't have, I invite you to do one thing today. Stop. Stop counting. Just stop. With the hand that you have too little, God delights in doing much with little. But hear me. Handing it to God is not the same thing as sitting back and doing nothing. Gideon didn't sit down before or after God reduced his army. He followed God's instructions and he reduced the army. And as we're going to see next week, he picked up the trumpet, the torch, and marched to the edge of the enemy camp. He acted. He trusted God and he moved his feet. That's what faith looks like. James tells us in chapter 2, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Trusting God does not mean waiting for him to do everything while we just sit back and watch. It means placing what we have in his hands and doing what he tells us to do with it. So here's what I'm asking. Stop counting what you lack. Start giving what you have to God. And then, like Gideon, get up and move. So pray, serve, show up, take the step. Trust God with the outcome, but you have to take the step. He is the only one who makes the small mighty. And he does it through people who are willing to move. And I know there's been times, and I feel this right now in my life, where I feel like I'm being reduced. I feel like I have nothing left. I feel like I'm going through the motions, but you know what? I'm going through those motions because I have faith that on the other side, God's going to take care of it. We all need to be doing the same thing. So this morning, if you feel broke, if you need help, you need encouragement, we're here for you. If you would, come forward, make that known to us. Help us to encourage you. Help us to all get to heaven together. That's what we all want. So if you would, please stand as we sing the song of invitation.
Faith is the victory. Encamped along the hills, a mighty Christian soldiers rise.